So the first thing we want to do when we're working in the kitchen is sanitize our station. That includes our scale. Today I'll be using the digital scale. As we discussed in our last week's lessons, the different types of scales, I'm going to be using the digital scale today. That's more of the standard for our industry. So first thing you want to do, any area you're working at, I am going to be working out of bulk mixing bowls, but just to show you general sanitation in video form, this is an all-purpose cleaner. All of our chemicals will be labeled in the kitchen, so you will see, we will get into that in later lessons. Your spray, the cleanser. I'm going to do my scale top. The good thing about the scale tops are they actually come off, so if you wanted to run it through the dish machine, you could. I prefer that you leave them on there. You can take them off, spray them, and put them back on, but this way the pieces of the scale stay together. That gets wiped, and then with our sanitizer, that gets sprayed on the table, on your scale, and we let that air dry. So today's bread, what we're going to be making is, as I told you, a lot of the recipes we're going to follow in the beginning of the year are from King Arthur flour. They're true and tried recipes. The company's been around forever, and the quantities, since we're not doing a lot of live production right now, the quantities make amounts that you can learn the technique, but we're not wasting a lot of ingredients. So, starting out, like we said, this has 4 basic ingredients. We got our flour, yeast, which is going to make our dough rise, salt, which, as we talked about before, helps control the overall process and also gives flavor, and we got some warm water. So we are going to be doing this in grams and some teaspoons, just because some of the quantities are so small. So, as we talked about using our scale before, put your bowl on there, zero it out. Remember, if it says 0.0, that's our US standard measurements. If we hit the white button in the unit, that'll get us into our grams. So the first thing we want to measure is 369 grams of flour. And as I said before, you can kind of go quick in the beginning. As you go through and you start getting up over close to that 3, we'll slow down how much flour we're putting in. Just about on there. And we're at 369. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use 2 bowls. Like I said, as you get more proficient, you could probably use 1 bowl, but this is just going to make my life easier today. So next thing we got, we're going to zero that scale out again. So we're still staying in grams with our warm water. Our quantity of warm water is 227 grams to 283. So as we discussed, depending on your room temperature, the humidity, you may need to add a little water. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to measure to 273 and then put the extra in there and see if I need any water afterwards. But with the room temperature in here and the outside, we should be pretty close with the 273. And again, with the water, it's easy to over measure, because as you start pouring it, it starts to come out pretty quickly. And as we discussed before, you want to be very accurate with baking. Even being off 5 to 10 grams can affect a recipe depending on the ingredient you're putting in. So we have our water separate, we have our flour, and I only need the 2 bowls. Since the rest of our ingredients, I'm going to start showing you some measurements with teaspoons and cups that we haven't got into. So this is weight measurement, this is volume measurement. So we need 2 teaspoons of yeast. And whenever you're measuring, a good rule of thumb is just level out whatever you're measuring. So our yeast is going to go right into the water. And as I told you before, yes, we are using instant yeast, but I still like to put that in the water just so I make sure everything's dissolved. Then we got our salt. That was 2 teaspoons of the yeast. Salt, we're doing 1.5 teaspoons. So if you kind of shake it, you can level it that way. But again, even when you're doing volume measurement, you want to be as accurate as you possibly can. And then what we want to do with that salt and the yeast, do a quick dissolve. Even though it's instant yeast, like I said, I stirred around in there just to make sure that it's all wet. Especially if you're using dry active yeast, even if you just kind of slightly mix it, you will see clumps of yeast. Then when you put it into your flour to make your dough, a lot of times it won't dissolve. So if you take the extra preparation during this step, will be good during the mixing process. All right, so we let that go a few minutes. We dissolved our yeast. We're gonna mix our dough. So I do have a mixer here. Later lessons, I will show you some of the operation of the mixer and using it. Since we're only making a small quantity and want to show you the dough preparation, dough development, I am going to mix it by hand. So if you're mixing by hand, you'll make a well or a hole in the middle of the flour. That way, when your liquid goes in the middle, you can bring the flour into the dough and you're not going to get your hands totally gummed up and gluey with the flour, as some of our students saw yesterday in the lesson. So we're bringing the flour from the outside to the in. As you develop your dough, you'll see it's kind of falling apart, shaggy mess. As you start to mix it in, we'll eventually turn this out to the spot on the table. Even though I'm mixing the bowl, yes, I have my sanitized section of the table. I did sanitize the whole entire table before I started, just to make sure everything was clean. Every day when you come in, you should clean and sanitize your table, and like I said, at least your scale. Your ingredient bowls, utensils, take a look at them, because sometimes maybe they still have some food product on them after they came out of the dish machine. So we want to make sure all of our stuff is clean and sanitary every time we're making something. So as you can see, it's starting to come together as a dough. Once I turn it out onto the table, I'm going to move my scale, my extra bowl out of the way so you can see it. And it'll pick up most of your flour at this point. So what I'll do, I dump that onto the table. And you can see I'm using this part of my hand called the heel. And yes, even though I did pull the dough from the end, I got a little flour on my hand. That's fine. As you develop your dough, all that flour will come off your hands. Yes, you might have a little bit on there afterwards and wash your hands, but as you'll see, baking, you're going to get your hands right into it, make some good dough. Most of your ingredients, sometimes when we're using the mixer, yes, you will not, but in the beginning lessons in small quantities, if you were making dough at home and didn't have a mixer, you could easily do this process without it. So as I said, the recipes that I'm putting up there, the only thing you might not have in your kitchen at home is yeast. That you can buy packets of in most stores. I know a few months ago, February, March, it was harder to get yeast. Products are starting to come back on the shelf, so you could get one package of yeast, pretty cheap. And as I said, the students that are coming in, as you come in, if you do want a sourdough starter, we'll cultivate a sourdough starter for you. So when you're doing this by hand, you'll see it's not real stretchy, it's still falling apart. That means we haven't developed that gluten. So as we talked about developing gluten, there's two proteins inside your flour, gliadin and glutenin. What happens is when you mix them with water, it will develop gluten. And you may hear of gluten, gluten intolerance, people can eat gluten. Yes, it does affect some people. Gluten is readily available in wheat flour once you mix that water in. A lot of other flours don't have gluten in it, or low amounts. So if you made a bread with them, they'd be very dense. And most of your, if you look at whole grain flours and things like that, if you looked at your ingredient list on the back, most of them have some sort of quantity of bread flour in it. So your bread flour has that gluten. That's what makes your dough nice and stretchy and gives it that structure that we like when we eat that nice warm bread, throw some butter on there. So you can feel after making dough or bread dough a few times, you'll be able to feel when you're starting to get close. It's starting to feel a little warmer, starting to feel stretchy in my hands. And then you'll see the dough itself is starting to get smooth. It's starting to hold together. And once our gluten really develops and it sits after the first rise, as one of the students pointed out, there's a thing called a window test. So you'll know when your dough is ready if you take a little piece and you can stretch it out till it's almost see-through. We're going to do that on the next part. So I'm just about ready to go. As you can see, dough's looking nice and smooth, starting to get stretchy, not ripping apart. Think of good gluten development is when that person is making the pizza dough. They're making that pizza dough, throwing it up in the air, getting it nice and stretchy. So I'm going to go about another 20 seconds with this. So think of just a recap going through. Make sure your area is sanitized, including your scale. That's clean and sanitized. Make sure when we're measuring out our ingredients, we're doing it diligently and as accurate as possible. Like I said, if you're off 1 gram, may not affect you, but if you're using other ingredients such as gelatin and you're off by 10 grams, you could get something that looks like a gummy bear instead of a nice dessert. So think of these things when you're mixing your dough, whether it's in the mixer or by hand. Think about really mixing it thoroughly so that when it comes out, you're going to have a nice developed dough, and that will make the difference between an okay bread and a really nice bread. So what I'm going to do, take this dough, put it back into my bowl, take it out into the kitchen, wrap it, let it rise, and then I'll come back for part. So to wrap up, we're going to look at our finalized dough. So as I said, we wrapped it, put it in our bowl. Some recipes will say oil your bowl, put a cloth over it, but for our purposes, if you put it in a bowl and make sure there's enough room for it to rise. And as was discussed in class the other day, if you look at doubles in size, if I stick my finger in the dough, it will leave that indentation. That's how we know our dough is done. So in our next series of videos, I'm going to show you shaping, proofing, and baking your rolls.